Luis is going to talk about something that we really haven't talked about in a very long time, which is pigeon management and prevention. And I'm just going to turn it over to you, Luis. Take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris, very much. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. So really appreciate the kind words. We really try, and we've been adapting to the IPM regime here in San Francisco and trying to do our best to meet the needs of the city and serve our stakeholders the best way we can. And so that's where this talk comes from. This is from my experience. I gave Taya like a bio that's kind of generic. My experience relevant to pigeon management is working for the last 20 years here in San Francisco with all the constraints that we have and all the special things that make this city so great, and applying what we've learned all the time and continually evolving. So I hope you learned something new today. Maybe not, maybe it'll be a refresher, but I'm sure we can at least have a good conversation at the end of it. So let's get started. So for today's presentation, I'm going to start with some quick evaluation to answer the questions of what doesn't work and why it doesn't work. Then we'll go through some general education on the behavior and biology of bed bugs, pigeons, very quick. What monitoring should look like, what we should be monitoring for, setting treatment thresholds, and the variety of treatments that we have available to us here in San Francisco. And then I'll talk a little bit about some prevention and some conclusions that we can come from after this presentation. But in general, let's start with just the IPM overview. We know as IPMers that the bulk of our efforts should be to educate our stakeholders, to implement pest prevention by design before we have a problem, and to help maintain a property to avoid growing pest problems. And the next step in the pyramid is to use physical or mechanical controls like traps to remove pests and reduce the population that's damaging the property. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how it applies to pigeons here in San Francisco. And then the different biological tools that we have available that we want to emphasize as they're less risky to non-target organisms. And then going into chemical controls with least risky first. So we're going to see how this pyramid fits into pigeon management in San Francisco. Whenever I'm doing a training, I like to remind myself first and the audience that it's us, it's we, the people that make the pest. The literal definition of any pest is it's a living organism that we decide doesn't belong. We build homes, infrastructures, our cities, and if we don't want something that's living there in that environment, we label it a pest. So in other words, pests are an organism that exploit an ecological niche that we create. When it comes to pigeons, we domesticated the wild rock doves. We use them for our purposes, transported them all over the world, and to some extent or another, we care for them and we protect them. Pest pigeons are a human construct. Our pest management programs for pigeons must therefore serve people, the people that have to work around them, live with them, including the people that are tasked with managing them. The humane treatment of pigeons ultimately serves people. I'm so proud to work and serve this city of enlightened people and to do my part to help sustain and improve the quality of life of our stakeholders here in the city by managing pests in general and pigeons specifically in a humane and effective manner. So I'd like to do a quick shout out to the patron saint of Pestec, Pedro Castro. Pedro worked for Pestec for over 20 years and served the city and county tirelessly. He taught me many things, above all else, that pest management is ultimately customer service. By listening to his customers, by consistently showing up, doing as he said he'd do, and always learning, Pedro earned the trust and admiration of our customers and his coworkers. Unfortunately, Pedro passed away at the end of 2020, the same day his wife passed away a few years before. I regret that we didn't make an announcement to his customers or to our stakeholders to honor his passing. And although he was suffering from poor health, his death came as a shock to us. So thank you for letting me take this moment to honor this good man, this professional, and to help put a face to the many times invisible but necessary work of pest management professionals around the world. Pedro's brother, Francisco, still works with us, and he leads our bird abatement team. He's a master at getting into tight spots with lift equipment and installing pigeon nets around complicated infrastructure. These skills take years of experience to develop, so we are appreciative of having had this opportunity and experience working in the city and county. So thank you. So last things first, what doesn't work in pigeon control and why doesn't it work? And I'm constantly asked by people, wow, pigeons must be so smart because they defeated those spikes that we installed, or pigeons must be so intelligent because they were able to get in past that net. I don't think that's the right word we want to use to describe pigeons. I think this video does a better job demonstrating what makes pigeons so successful in our environment. They're persistent. They are unrelenting. They are homing birds. Once they make a nest somewhere, they always want to get back to that nest. And they'll keep trying over and over and over again until they literally get themselves stuck on a spike. They'll put things on top of spikes. They'll peck through nets. They'll get in and they won't stop. So we have to take what we know about pigeons and we have to at least embody this same sentiment. We need to be unrelenting when it comes to managing them. We also know what doesn't work, and now I lost my presenter notes. Let me see how I can get them back. 1 second. So as IPMers, I'm sure you already know what doesn't work when it comes to pigeon management. We have great examples from all over the world and here in the heart of our city. The #1 strategy that doesn't work is ignoring them. We know, given human psychology and behavior, that ignoring pigeons will lead to more pigeons. Trafalgar Square in England is a prime example of this. Pigeons began colonizing the square before the construction of it was even completed in 1844. Where the pigeons came from, why they were there to begin with, always leads back to people. We know for sure that the pigeons were a hit among the locals and that feed sellers began selling seeds to feed the pigeons right away. One estimate that I found for the population of pigeons in the square was up to 4,000 birds. So where there are pigeons, there will always be people delighted to feed them and growing them. And I'm sure all of you have seen examples of pigeon control failures. There are countless examples you've probably seen on your walk through downtown on your commute, or pigeons nesting behind or within a bed of spikes, for example. Whereas there's many approaches to controlling feral pigeons, the failures usually boil down to 3 main reasons. #1, the strategy is too limited in scope. #2, the tactics are incompletely or improperly implemented. And #3, the tactics are insufficiently maintained. The most common strategy employed in San Francisco is physical deterrence or exclusion. We'll talk about these in more detail later, which ones we prefer and why. These tactics work great when they're used to prevent birds from nesting to begin with. However, as we talked about, pigeons are homing birds, and so that means they're going to unrelentingly try to get back to those nests. This behavior is a feature, it's not a bug. We have selected for it and used this homing behavior throughout the history of humankind by farmers, sailors, militaries, business people, and pigeon enthusiasts. It is this persistence that wears down our resolve as pest managers and the materials we use. When we manage pigeons with physical controls, only we oftentimes move the birds to the periphery of the installations. So there's a variety of repellents used for pigeon control. These can be effective, or they can leave you with bird poop on your face if used alone. Harvesting or culling pigeon populations is not practiced in San Francisco, but it's still commonplace in many jurisdictions. The best research I could find that discusses this approach is from the US Department of Fish and Wildlife, published in 1990. The researchers found that reductions in the population size of adult pigeons led to a decrease in the mortality of eggs and nestlings, which led to a rapid recovery in the population size. So in other words, when you cull adult pigeons, the pigeons that would have not survived otherwise survive, and you get a rebound effect very quickly. There was one note, though, that this research has made, which is that population estimates suggest that feral pigeon populations cannot sustain an annual harvest of larger than 35% of the fall population without declining. So again, in other words, it takes an over 35% in the decrease of the adult population to achieve a reduction the following year. This research was carried out in rural New York, so it's unclear if it would hold in our milder winters here. So to achieve a 35% reduction in the adult population of pigeons would require a significant and coordinated effort. Whether that could be conducted in a humane manner and with sufficient buy-in is highly questionable. Fortunately, we do have a variety of alternatives and enough foresight to know that doing nothing is not an option. So what makes pigeons a pest? Pigeon droppings are number one. They pose several harms to people. The droppings are rich in nutrients and thus become exploited by various fungal pathogens and bacteria that pose a risk to people. There are many diseases associated with pigeon droppings, and people with immunocompromised or that are immunocompromised are at greatest risk. Infections of these diseases occur when people breathe in the dust from the droppings, usually when cleaning them. I don't think we have an epidemic of pigeon-associated diseases, however, but the risk is there. And can you imagine having to breathe pigeon guano dust on a daily basis because you have a flock living overhead? Or coming into your workplace and having to start the day by cleaning off pigeon droppings from your workspace? Without the ongoing effort to manage pigeons in some of our critical infrastructure, this is exactly what many of our peers have had to deal with on a daily basis. This filth, paired with flies that come with them, makes a notable impact on the quality of life for people at work, people at home, and people that want to enjoy the cityscape and everything that it has to offer. I found this OSHA citation online of a railway company in Montana that was cited for pigeon droppings. The citation says, employees are exposed to a variety of illnesses, including but not limited to ornithosis, encephalitis, Newcastle disease, toxoplasmosis, salmonella, and histoplasmosis when the employer did not ensure that the repair shops were adequately maintained in a clean and sanitary condition, free from buildup of bird species. Pigeon droppings pose an enforceable workplace health and safety issue. Pigeon droppings also pose a risk to infrastructure. In 2007, a 40-year-old bridge that crosses the Mississippi and Minnesota collapsed, killing 13 people and injuring 100 commuters that plunged into the river below. Experts put forward a theory that steel beams rusted faster due to the ammonia acids in the accumulated pigeon droppings. When pigeon droppings dry out, they turn into a concentrated salt. If the guano is not washed away, water reacts with it and makes a weak electrochemical reaction that rusts the steel faster. Pigeon droppings also pose a risk to historic buildings. Limestone and calciferous sandstone are at greatest risk from pigeon droppings. With the droppings are acidic enough to dissolve the stone, and it's the fungus that lives in the excrement that makes the most damage. The mycelium of the fungi enter the stone and transport the acid with it. This process increases the porosity of the stone's structure, allowing water to penetrate more easily. In climates that freeze, trapped water expands as it crystallizes and can weaken the stone and cause spalling or flaking. What else makes a pigeon a pest? Besides the pathogens that pigeons carry and spread with their feces, we're also harmed by the ectoparasites or external parasites they carry. Remember, ectoparasites are external parasites that live on the body of another animal versus the kind that live inside another animal. Ectoparasites are in general specialists and well adapted to the behavior and biology of their preferred hosts. For example, Cymex lectularius, or the human bedbug, is perfectly adapted to our nests, making a home in, under, and around our beds. And although they prefer people, they will bite other warm-blooded animals when their food supply is scarce. The same thing applies to the ectoparasites of pigeons. Generally speaking, the ectoparasites feed on the immature pigeons in the nest and the otherwise unhealthy birds, accelerating their poor health. If the birds are overcome by their illnesses, if the adults do not make it back to the nests, or if the infestation becomes so heavy that the population of birds is not enough to support the parasites, some of these secondary pests may make their way inside buildings or fall from nests onto unsuspecting people below. I don't know from personal experience, however, I've had many customers tell me that the mite bites they received are the worst, itchiest bites they've ever had. Usually it's not very evident what the bites are coming from, so people tend to suffer for long periods of time. They doubt themselves, or they go to great lengths to self-treat. If they do not address the infestation that is in the pigeon nest, at the window ledge, or overhead, their efforts go to waste and the bites and suffering continues. So let's talk about behavior biology, some history of pigeon and people, and legal considerations that comes from it. Pigeons occupy a special ecological niche in our urban centers. They are commensal birds, meaning they literally and figuratively eat from our tables. Our scraps, our litter, the spillage outside our dumpsters, and the food that's delivered to them like clockwork from people young, old, and everywhere in between. They eat about a pound of food a week. Pigeon fanciers spend top dollar on specialized seed mixes. We know that wild rock doves eat seeds and insects, while our feral neighbors eat all of the above and animal waste and other detritus with minimal nutritional value. This could be why many of our local inhabitants don't look very healthy. They are eating an unbalanced diet of junk food and refined flour breads that are offered to them daily. Just as with all living things on Earth, water is necessary for pigeon life, and it's a substantial amount. Pigeons consume about 1 to 2 ounces of water daily, and they weigh only 13 ounces, an adult pigeon. Pigeons can be found exploiting car washes, fountains, and the puddles left after washing down our streets and sidewalks. I think that this is a key point, and is something we'll talk more about when we get to the range of treatment options at our disposal. Wild pigeons nest in sea cliffs and other places out of reach from terrestrial predators. They don't require much shelter. A nook, crevice, cranny will do. And if you have nested birds on site, you may find that after you attempt to exclude them, they'll move to the floor or to the shelves or any on top of a camera fixture, anywhere they can go that hasn't been excluded, which is why I put that they'll nest anywhere. Pigeons are monogamous and will breed once per year in colder climates. In our mild winters, they breed year-round. Pigeons will usually lay 2 eggs at a time and rear them over a short duration of about 1 month. So the history of pigeons and people goes back to, literally thousands of years. The first documented history is Babylonian cuneiform texts talking about raising pigeons in dovecotes. Pigeons are depicted as embodiments of gods and goddesses, of love, of the Holy Spirit. They hold a very special place in human culture. When we did domesticate pigeons, we most likely used them as a source of food, as they produce prodigiously, and their young, squab, are still considered by many to be a delicacy. Pigeons were a perfect complement to agricultural production of grain. Early grain production resulted in lots of spillage. Grain that was left in the field would otherwise result in waste and pest problems. Pigeons were the perfect protein machines. Left to their own devices to forage for this grain, they returned to the dovecotes to rear their young. This carbohydrate to protein conversion system was employed by cultures throughout the world and only recently lost favor in the United States after World War II with the advent of industrial chicken farming practices. Besides the high quality, low cost meat produced by pigeons, the chief byproduct, their guano or feces, had a couple of highly valuable uses as well. Rich in nitrogen, pigeon guano was used historically to produce saltpeter, a primary ingredient in black gunpowder. Pigeon guano was also used for traditional leather tanning, and this process is still in use today. So as IPMers, we have an intimate relationship with the forces of life. For people that do not interact with life and death, it can be easy to get lost in the romanticism of simpler times. I, for one, am very happy to have learned this trade, IPM, from my father, and to get to work with all of you to serve people, to protect our spaces, and to help improve and sustain the quality of life for our stakeholders. I'm not ashamed to say I prefer learning about what I'm about to show you from a video than from firsthand experience. But I know people are adaptable, and I could have just as easily been born to a family of leather artisans and done my best to be the best one possible.
So Luis, we aren't hearing the sound on this. You might want to.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. You could just tell us what's happening.
Well, yeah. The point is, this is a 600-year-old leather tannery in Morocco, and they're using pigeon guano as a for the tanning process. The guano is very acidic, and it, as the father in the video says, it bites into the leather, making it supple and soft. I think the point I'm trying to make is that pigeons were a valuable resource throughout history, but I'm, happy that at least I don't have to use this resource, and I don't know if it really has a place anymore in a humane society that we want to live in. Sorry, I keep losing my presenter notes. So due to the pigeon's homing behavior and resilience, they've been used by military and civilians throughout human history. Ancient seafarers kept pigeons on board to help them reorient to land. Later, they were used for communicating rapidly over long distances. G.I. Joe, the American hero of World War II, helped save the lives of inhabitants of an Italian village and the British troops that won it back from the German army ahead of schedule. As a last resort, G.I. Joe was dispatched to carry a message to the Allied forces at their base to stop the air support that was previously ordered. He flew 20 miles in 20 minutes, just in time to stop the planes as they were preparing to take off for their target. G.I. Joe is credited with saving 100 Allied troops from potential disaster. Julius Reuters of the Reuters news organization created an empire on the back of pigeons. He used a flock of pigeons to bridge a gap in telegraph lines and transmit financial information to his stakeholders. And today, there are pigeon enthusiasts around the world that rear pigeons for sport, for speed in races, and also for their quirks in behavior or genetics, and for their genetics, such as roller pigeons that flip in the sky, or grow fantastic plumes or weird features that are prized for their uniqueness. Pigeons are unlike any other pest. They are at once a beloved pet, a valuable agricultural commodity, and a biological technology that has been shaped by and helped shape human history since our humble beginnings. So since pigeons are not a migratory species, they are not protected by federal or state statute. In San Francisco, however, it's a different story. Article 7 of the San Francisco Police Code addresses animals and birds. Section 485 prohibits trapping or killing birds, except that pigeons or other wild birds which become a nuisance or hazard to public health may be trapped or captured in a humane manner by or with the permission of the Director of Public Health. 485 goes on to say that the trapper must then transport them in a humane manner and release them to some remote area. 485.1 prohibits sterilization except by or under supervision of the Director of Public Health. 486 prohibits feeding wild animals. This law is essential as it's well understood that pigeon feeding creates unsustainable growth of the population, leading to sicker pigeons, bigger nuisances, and damages. And as we talked about before, it plays into human psychology and creates a vicious cycle where people believe the pigeons need them to feed them. Where you had one pigeon feeder triggered by a flock waiting to clean up after lunch, you get shifts of feeders taking turns to feed the birds. Spend a day in Holiday Plaza and you know exactly what I mean. Section 487 authorizes and directs the Director of Public Works to develop a humane plan for reducing roosting and breeding areas for pigeons where there is a high population density. So bird feeders abound in San Francisco. This is, I guess, an educational gap that needs to be made, but really plays deeply into the psychology of people. And I don't think signage will ever do the trick. So what should we be monitoring for pigeon management? Our number one priority is to keep pigeons from establishing nests. We have already learned pigeons are homing birds. They will relentlessly want to return to their nest. Any nest should be destroyed immediately and persistently. Loafers are the pigeons that loiter in an area, usually around where people eat or spill food frequently. It's important to keep an eye out for them as they are much easier to get to leave with some of the tactics we'll explore next. However, where there are a few pigeons, a pigeon feeder is not far off. A few friendly birds can easily turn into hundreds of birds from the persistent feeding of our well-intentioned neighbors. Since we know that given the contributing factors, pests will come, we should always be on the lookout for those contributing conditions. This means keeping watch for feeders, for litter, and for the choice nesting spots that pigeons will eventually find. Deterrents work great before nests are established, so setting them up early on is the best and most humane defense. Finally, let's keep an eye on costs. Of course, pigeon abatement takes resources, but how many resources do we lose from pigeon droppings, from the constant cleanup after them and the underutilized spaces that they contribute to? San Francisco is not only home to some of the most enlightened people in the world, it's also home to the highest real estate values. Any space that is being spoiled by pigeons and not being enjoyed by people is shameful, in my opinion. We must preserve the city for its citizens and its visitors, which undoubtedly means there will be pigeons because people love pigeons. Like most structural pest control or pest management, setting action thresholds for pigeons is more art than science. Everything is dependent on the place, the time, the people, and of course the budget. How many loafing pigeons are too many? I don't know. How about nests? My point of view is one nest is one too many. Once they get established and with the limitations we have for removing them, properties get stuck hosting those pigeons for years to come. How about feeders? How many people can we have feeding pigeons stale bread and rice before we have an unhealthy and costly pigeon problem on our hands? Do we want to enforce the anti-feeding law? What would be the best way to do it? And again, signage probably won't do the trick. After a long hiatus of working in the Tenderloin, I worked there for about 10 years after I graduated high school to about 2010. I've been spending more time in the neighborhood lately, and I've been pleasantly surprised. The streets are cleaner, the vibe is calmer, and there are uniformed personnel on every corner. These practitioners, as they call themselves, are employed by Urban Alchemy. This organization puts people with a high threshold for stress and the skills to de-escalate potentially volatile situations in the places where they are needed most. On the street, in the corners, the places where people gather to abuse drugs or menace others, intentionally or not, with their presence. What's Urban Alchemy's magic? They say relationships, which I'm sure is the case. They see the same faces every day, and it's impossible not to bond with people you interact with kindness. I think the magic is a humanizing presence. By occupying the space, they don't allow people to retreat into obscurity. This is taking me to treatment and interventions. Can we learn something from this success and apply it to another issue we want to be humane about? So what's the solution? A comprehensive and holistic approach, of course. That's easier said than done. Source control is the primary problem. Without addressing the carrying capacity of the niche pigeons exploit, it'll always be an uphill battle. Perhaps the urban alchemy model could be applied to feeders. My sense is that people that feed pigeons are either chronically feed pigeons, which is different than, casually doing it, are either lonely or don't want to interact with people. They prefer animals. In either case, a friendly and persistent practitioner could dissuade them from feeding by being present and cleaning up the food scraps they've tossed to the birds. Similar initiatives, plus, have been implemented in Europe. Municipal dovecotes were installed in Basel, Switzerland, and a number of other places. Residents were educated that feeding the birds creates overcrowding and unhealthy pigeon populations, and were instructed to go to a sanctioned feeding area to feed high quality seed to the birds. These municipal dovecotes serve a few purposes. Number one, they created a bullseye for the pigeons to poop on. They concentrated the pigeon activity to an area that could be readily and efficiently cleaned. Number two, the eggs that were laid were replaced with wooden eggs or some other way to control the hatching of those eggs, either by addling, which is shaking the eggs, pinning the eggs, or coating them in oil, so that they could control the pigeon population. The Pigeon Action of Basel, where a lot of this is based from, this information, reported a 50% drop in pigeons over 4 years. New information is not readily accessible, and although PETA and another organization in Europe continue to advocate for this system, information online was relatively scarce. This leads me to believe that ultimately it wasn't sustainable. Organisms have a drive to reproduce, and when they weren't, I imagine they moved elsewhere, or new pigeons moved into the area and the number increased regardless. Fortunately for us, we don't have massive flocks of birds like Trafalgar Square to contend with. So let's get into treatment. Excluding pigeons from the preferred nesting spaces is always the best option. Negative spaces are the spaces in between architectural elements. In this example, the negative space is the space between the toilet and the drain. This might be a good design for a floor, less urine on the soles of your shoes, but designing buildings with negative space means designing for pigeons. The best bet is to avoid negative spaces in new buildings and to close them off in existing buildings. Exclusion with netting is almost always the preferred option. The netting lasts at least 10 years when it's exposed to UV radiation, and a lot longer when it's not. We recommend using a 3/4 inch netting. Originally, manufacturers were recommending a 2-inch netting, but smaller birds were able to get in and many times getting stuck. Recently, we had to do a emergency release of a hawk that got into a 2-inch net that we didn't install, but that we plan on going back to repair with a smaller net. Black net is usually preferred. From a distance, it's the least conspicuous. And we always use stainless steel hardware when we are installing these nets in San Francisco and other coastal areas to keep it from corroding as quickly. The nets are hung on a cable system. So you create a cable frame that's attached to the substrate and suspend the net onto that. It's important to install zippers on around light fixtures and different mechanical areas so that when the tradespeople need to go and maintenance those areas, they don't cut the net open and let pigeons in. And it's important to limit vertical installations. Sometimes you may want to use a net to create a wall to keep pigeons from getting behind things. If you're doing that, it's important to protect, where that net attaches to the wall or where there's ledges in front of that net. We have seen pigeons being persistent over time, able to actually peck through nets, given enough time and given a ledge to be able to stand on to do it. The cost of avoiding some negative spaces may be more costly than installing a net and replacing it every 10 years or so, like this carport. In other instances, the cost of installing and replacing a net every 10 years may be too disruptive, costly, and an eyesore. So this is the photo that we used on our cover page. This is not to pick on anybody, but it's just something that I had. It's a picture I had readily accessible and demonstrates the point. In this picture, you can see where the construction team installed some ledge deterrents. So that'll keep some loafing pigeons from hanging out here. It doesn't stop them from getting onto this ceiling, however. But you can see all this negative space that I'm talking about in here, where pigeons are already getting to and are already going to love. This is the Yerba Buena subway building. And this is at the entrance over the escalator. So from this corner where the pigeons are already nesting, it's about 50 feet up off the floor. It's impossible to get any lift equipment in there. It's impossible to reach this corner and other than with the use of a scaffold. So this is going to be a tricky problem that we'll have to address once we get the chance. And then here's a little picture of how pigeons defeated this this netting. Little video. So either the net came undone from that corner, or like I said, they were able to chew from the outside to get in. So this is a complicated installation because you have all these electrical cables around. It takes lots of coordination to be able to go and maintain this. But even so, the netting there was still the best option for controlling the pigeons versus trying to control every potential ledge that they could hang out on. Another example of using exclusion are these different slopes. These slopes can be bought ready-made in plastic that are easy to cut, paintable, and will fit most ledges. They come with extensions, so you can make the slope bigger to fit the area. These angled slopes fit into ledges like these windows and keeps birds from being able to make a nest or to loaf in those areas or roost. This is something that we've seen trade people do on their own using metal, and we've seen schools use plywood, for example, and is very effective. Ledge deterrents can be used for light to medium pressure, meaning birds that are not nesting there. If pigeons have already nested on the ledge, it'll take more than bird spikes to stop them. Make sure that the bird spike overhangs the ledge by at least ½ an inch and has a space between the wall and the spike of no more than 2 inches. Bird wire is the preferred choice for pest prevention in new construction. It's fairly easy to install, very discreet from a distance, and is effective at deterring pigeons from becoming established. The system can be anchored into masonry or installed with glue on post holders. The system is designed with alternating rows of high and low posts, and it suspends a thin cable across the posts that are attached to these springs. So when pigeons land on these ledges, they hit this unstable landing surface, they don't like it, and they take off. Again, this only works when pigeons haven't already nested at the site. Otherwise, they'll be persistent and they'll just nest right on top of it. Defeat it usually by putting twigs and other things to make it a stable area. Gels and electrical track provide protection with some sensory effect for stubborn pigeons. The gels are EPA-exempt pesticides made with food-grade ingredients and either scented with geranium oil or with pepper oils for a hot foot reaction. Electrical track is installed with glues and connected to a solar charger or directly plugged into an electrical source. The shock is non-lethal. Both systems require maintenance. Bird gels will last 6 months to 2 years, depending on bird pressure and dust or debris that accumulates on it. The electrical track requires maintenance to remove detritus that can short out the system. Components are warranted for 5 years. The big benefit of the electrical track is that it works for pigeons and other birds like seagulls, which are much bigger and won't be affected by bird wire or spikes. And it can be used for higher pressure areas where you need an extra push to get the pigeons to leave. Repellents are oftentimes very effective at first, but over time, the birds become habituated to them. To avoid habituation, these repellents should be paired with other controls and are used intermittently. So some of those psychological repellents would be like the owl eye. There's also some sound repellents that sound like a falcon that's attacking a pigeon, a squawking pigeon that's dying. We used this maybe 20 years ago on the Sony Metreon for seagulls in particular. It worked great for a couple weeks, and then after that they came back. Without actual predation happening, without any impact and a constant sound that's being played, the birds learn that it's not actually a threat and just make their way back. A new repellent to us that we've tested at 3 different sites for SFMTA is called avian repellent. The material has an active ingredient called methyl anthranilate, which is derived from grape skins. This material has historically been used in agriculture to protect ripening berries and is labeled for treating water as well. A new delivery device is the bird buffer system, pictured here, a low volume auto vapor dispensing device to fog areas. The effect of the repellent on birds is physiological, not psychological. Unlike the psychological repellents, they can't learn to ignore it. It makes them feel sick. The process for implementing this system is as follows. First, the roosting and nesting sites are cleaned with a cleaning solution and avian repellent is added. This starts to move them from their nesting or loafing sites. Birds then are hazed with the product using a fogging applicator while you're doing your exclusion. The device is then installed with attention to airflow and then calibrated to the duration and frequency of application needed to maintain sufficient concentrations to be effective. Over time, birds will learn to avoid the area and the device can be adjusted to the current conditions. This repellent can be used without the dispenser and should be utilized when installing netting or deterring pigeons from entering an area where they were previously habituated to. So we're starting to use this when we're doing any installation so that we can start pushing those pigeons out of those spaces and keep them from coming back there. So far, questions that always come up when we use this: is it going to leave a film, a sticky kind of thing behind? It doesn't. It's a dry vapor that doesn't land on the floor. Is the smell very strong? When we first started using it, it did seem to be very strong. I don't know if something happened with the formulation, but while it's in use, you almost hardly can't smell it, and it smells like a cleaning product. According to the World News Program and NPR, the flock of 4,000 pigeons in Trafalgar Square was resolved with the use of falconers. That and the cessation of pigeon feeding in the square. Harassment is similar to repellents, except that there is an active agent that is moving the birds around. Falconers have been employed in San Francisco before. Perhaps Chris, you can, or anyone that was present when there was a demonstration before my time can share that story at the end of the presentation. Falcons eat pigeons and may selectively take a pigeon during the course of their work. However, the intention is instead to discourage the flock and get them to leave. I don't have experience with this practice directly, but from what I understand, falcons are highly effective when they're present. When they're not, the drive of returning home and the pool of dinner seems like too much to keep pigeons away for long. Other harassment techniques include the use of dogs, like Chris had mentioned, for Canadian geese. This could be potentially applied to pigeon control as well. And I'm thinking in terms of Holiday Plaza, for example. So I actually have a little example for you. This is my pandemic puppy on one of my walks over the weekend, where we did a little work together chasing some pigeons around. She's still in training. She's only a year and a couple months old, but she'll be ready to hire very soon. We just need a sponsor. So let us know if you'd like to employ Leela, the pigeon harasser, anytime soon. And then I have another quick video. I wish the audio worked, but it doesn't really matter, does it? So while I was researching this presentation, I had the idea, well, why aren't we using drones to scare off pigeons? And I reached out to the SF Drone School, which is located on Treasure Island, and they pointed me to this company that created a falcon drone. And the idea is the same idea as using a real falcon, except that this is one that is operated on the ground by a technician versus a falconer. And I think the promise of this is in the future, the technology will improve and it can become more automated, where you could have a drone, potentially cruising an area on a regular basis so that it's a more persistent presence. And this is something that we're already working on as well. So I have my son and his buddy, best friend, went to the SF Drone School, and they're working on getting their FAA drone operators certification. The amazing thing is that the best drone operators are gamers. They're youth. So this is a great way for me to connect with my kid and get him, out of the house and doing something productive. He learned what drone operators charge for their time, and that really got him motivated. So I think that at some point there's going to be a role for drone operators and IPM programs. Maybe it will be for pigeon management. So let's talk about selective population control. We have limited options. In other jurisdictions, people are still trapping and euthanizing birds. They're shooting birds. We know that the police code, with permission by DPH, can allow for the trapping and release of pigeons. For that to work, considering that they're homing birds, you would have to trap, relocate, temporarily house the birds, feed them, get them to nest in that remote area. And once they start nesting there, that would be where they would be habituated to, as long as they have food there. So it's a question if that would work. The other option that we have is sterilization. According to the police code, we did do a pilot using ovo control many years ago in Holiday Plaza. What resulted, it was a 1-year pilot. We started off with a flock of 100 birds. By the end of it, we had about 200 birds, unfortunately. In talking to the manufacturer, their point of view was, well, there's a lot of food competition. You're in a center square with lots of viewpoints all around you, so you're attracting, birds from all over the area. And if you want to be effective, you have to cast a wider net and use more feeding stations. We had a couple other experiences with ovo control, one at Pier 96 for ecology, where we tried to feed pigeons there. They preferred the food that's available all over the waste recycling transfer station. And we had one other experiment or pilot at Laguna Honda Hospital, where there's some avid bird feeders, and there's someone there that really loves the birds for sure. And our bird feeder was sabotaged a few times, we think by someone that didn't feel that we should be trying to keep them from having babies. So we canceled that pilot as well. I did talk with the manufacturer of ovo control, or the sales rep, before, in preparation for this presentation. He said that ovo control, the best places are industrial sites like oil refineries and other areas that are impossible to exclude birds, where there's low food competition, and where you can get the reach of a majority of the population. I think for ovo control to work at some scale, you probably have to get to that 35% of the population ratio that the Fish and Wildlife Department talked about in 1990. So ultimately, that leaves us with biological controls and beneficial organisms. So we discussed the falconer service that's available. Whether or not use for population control is legal or palatable is another question. Our current best option in San Francisco for reducing the population directly is allowing Mother Nature to take its course. We have a variety of beneficial organisms that, given the chance and not dissuaded by other foods, may be helpful in limiting pigeon population. Everyone that I know that has dealt with pigeon problems love red-tailed hawks. This photo was taken in the marina and posted on Reddit. And just people, they love to see the hawks. If you've ever witnessed a hawk capture a pigeon, you'll likely be shocked and then awed by the explosion of feathers it leaves behind. We do know, however, that the predator-prey relationship keeps populations of both in check. As prey populations decrease, so follow the predator population. However, we have an increasing number of predators in San Francisco, including more hawks, crows, and coyotes. I'm waiting for the day that the coyotes reach Market Street and get to Holiday Plaza, where there's a buffet of 100 birds waiting on the ground every night for the opportunistic predator to show up. There's also opportunistic feeders such as rats, raccoons, and seagulls that can be enticed to eat more pigeons if we continue to improve the sanitation of our streets as well. So at the top of the pediment on the facade of City Hall, behind the head of the statue right here, is a crow's nest. I have a general fascination with crows, but these are my favorite ones. I can't say for certain how when they moved in, but about 6 years ago, we got the opportunity to do some abatement around the building and get a closer look at the crows. Birds do enjoy the building, but mostly small sparrows that alight on these different cornices, these structural elements, and they enter some of these smaller spaces. But there are very few pigeon nests on the front of this building. There's a couple on the sides. My suspicion is that the crows are keeping those pigeon populations in check. We know that crows eat hatchlings. So sanitation. We know for source control, it's essential that we always be improving sanitation. That means cleaning up litter in our streets and potentially trying to limit water or change the water. We know that that avian repellent is labeled to be used in water. It's an idea. Could we use avian repellent in our wash water? So, or can we apply avian repellent directly to that wash water that's left behind so we can keep the birds from exploiting that? It might be worth a shot. And do we need to pay attention to the refuse areas around our buildings where birds typically loaf around the day and clean up after us as we spill food there? So I don't know how I did on time. This is the first time I've given this presentation, but in conclusion, human-derived problems require humane solutions. To address chronic feeders, we need to address chronic feeders if we're going to address or control the source of pigeon populations in San Francisco. We know that integrated tactics work, so we can use physical deterrence, exclusion with some of these new repellents or new harassment technologies that are coming. And I really believe that more practitioners are good for IPM. They don't necessarily have to be pest management professionals. They just need to be people professionals. So with that, I think we can open it up for discussion, Chris.
Wow, thank you. That was quite a roundup. I'm really happy we're recording this.